On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain. And so she had gone to the doctor and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection and she was given antibiotics for it. But despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse. She was losing weight and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, "We really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at." But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, "You know what? I'm taking you to the hospital." And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, "We think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it." And so Mark said, "Okay, that sounds great." And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, "Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room." But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there.